There's a lot of drama around housing and politics in Canada right now. In Toronto, the federal government threatened to take away $30 million in funding if they didn't make their sixplex policy bigger and better than what they were proposing. And over on the West Coast, Vancouver condo developers are petitioning the government to try and get foreign buyers to be able to buy their condos, which I don't see happening, and nor do the politicians so far, with BC's premier going as far as saying that model is dead and we are not going back to the Wild West days of empty condos and foreign investment racking up the prices, according to their housing minister. If you want a good background on what that looked like, they basically found that 1 in 3 pre-construction condo units during a period of time were sold to foreign investors from China. And it shouldn't come as a surprise that developers want to get back to that model. It got a lot of housing built. Basically, over the last 20 years, the way that we got housing built was by using pre-construction investors who would put in their deposit that would later become part of the capital stack to fund these projects before the developer had to start building them. And this allowed developers to actually significantly reduce their equity requirement in a project, where for a condo project, they'd need about 15% equity in the total equity in the project. And a lot of that would come from the entitlements or rezoning the land that would increase the value. Whereas in a purpose-built rental, they would need about 35%. But a lot of that has changed. Since CMHC's MLI Select financing came out, we've seen a huge increase in the number of rental units that CMHC is insuring and a huge decrease in the number of homeowners that they're insuring, to the point where the big drop that we've been seeing in pre-construction condo starts has mostly been backfilled by purpose-built rental housing starts. And CMHC has made this possible by higher loan to value, which means less equity for the developer, longer amortizations, which means more cash flow for the developer, even though it takes them longer to pay that mortgage, therefore making it more and more compelling for them to build purpose-built rental. So if BC's premier is correct and the condo model is in fact dead, the important question becomes, what model isn't dead? And if I had to guess, it would be multiplexes or missing middle housing. And I'm going to spend some time comparing and contrasting why missing middle is different, why it's better and worse. And towards the end, we're going to have an expert from our upcoming event, Unpacking Multiplexes, where we talk in depth about multiplexes. One of our most requested speakers, returning from last year, Brandon Sage, who runs a company called landlord.net. They manage a ton of multiplexes and a ton of condos. And so we're going to have him on to go through one of their multiplex projects and talk about how these are different from a management and design perspective when you compare them to condos. Now, whenever I talk about missing middle, people get all defensive. They're like, we don't need more shoebox units. We can't replace shoebox high rises with shoebox multiplex units. And I agree, and policymakers agree. This is why multiplexes by design have much larger units than condo buildings, and by policy have to have much larger units than these high-rise condo buildings. And you'll see that with the unit that we're going through with Brandon. People are all like, oh, 15-minute cities, we don't need more urbanization, blah, blah, blah. Don't tell people how to live. And the reality is I'm not telling people how to live. I don't live in an urban area. I live in a rural area, and I plan to do that for the rest of my life. And I actually think that's the best way of living. And that's, for me, is great. But the reality is firms and policymakers exist to serve the market. And the market has made it very clear what its intentions are by urbanizing. Whether or not that's a result of economics and needing to shrink their space or whatever it is, historically, there are many patterns of people urbanizing. And in Canada, something like over 70% of people live in urban areas. And in the world, something like 70 to 80% of people will live in urban areas by 2050. So we can set aside this being some sort of personal opinion that I had and understand that this is just what the economy wants. And that's why I think this is an important discussion to have. If millions and millions of people were leaving urban areas and wanting to live on farms and build their own barn dominiums and start a homestead to feed themselves, I would probably be doing videos about that because I love that shit. But that's not what the market wants. Okay, so to understand what's happening with multiplexes in the city of Toronto, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. And the beginning was a document called Expanding Housing Options in Neighborhood. And it all started with this. This was a bold move from the city of Toronto to dismantle their outdated zoning laws and allow up to 4plexes citywide as of right, which actually meant 5 units because you could do a 4plex plus 1 garden suite which meant no lengthy approvals. It was a game changer, opened the door to gentler density in a city where single-family homes have historically dominated. And you can't go to any like other world city and find a single-family detached house within walking distance to a subway station. It's just not how it works. Yet, here we are in Toronto. And you also need to understand that the federal government has this thing called the Housing Accelerator Fund, where basically the federal government gives money to municipalities if they meet housing targets. And so they've really been pushing municipalities to upzone to gentle density, missing middle, multiplexes. And by early 2024, Housing Accelerator Fund deal with Ottawa pushed for sixplexes across all wards in the city of Toronto. And then it recently went to a vote. The goal of this was to try and get 55,000 new units by 2031, according to a 2025 Spacing Toronto analysis. But on June 25th, 2025, the dream hit a wall. City Council voted to scale back their multiplex planning so that only a few areas in the city of Toronto would be able to develop sixplexes. Fourplexes would still be allowed citywide, but sixplexes were only in downtown East York and the York wards, and fourplexes were available everywhere else. The federal government pushed back and basically said, if you don't do that, you're going to lose $30 million of your Housing Accelerator Fund money. And the pivot sparked a lot of outrage. The question becomes, why did politicians backtrack? And the big reason was local resistance and political caution. But since then, Mayor Olivia Chow has basically stated to her fellow policymakers that we need to get this thing done citywide, and we're going to remove development charges on sixplexes as well. Now, there's an important thing to note here. When CMHC increased their premiums for MLI Select, they basically destroyed the business case for the fourplex or 4+1 multiplexes to work in the city of Toronto. The margins were already incredibly tight. Basically, people were developing these fourplexes before at a high 3, low 4% yield on cost, which really only makes sense if you're getting incredibly good credit products like MLI Select. Like, you wouldn't go and buy a 3.8 cap if you didn't have access to a credit product like MLI Select, or you shouldn't. But a lot of people were building them because it was a good way to get brand new supply that you could hold for a long period of time. And if your hypothetical hold period was infinite, then it made sense. Going from 4 units to 6 units improved that yield on cost from, let's say, a 3.8, which we have here in a model scenario. This is basically taking the same piece of land. Let's say you're paying about $1.5 million and you're building the same square footage. So let's say you're building an 8,000 square foot plex, but in the sixplex, you're adding 2 units. So you get 2 extra kitchens, 2 extra bathrooms. I think I put those in at $50K per unit. You actually get a greater improvement from increasing the number of units than you do from removing development charges. So you get about a 20% increase in your yield on cost from going from a fourplex to a sixplex, even if you had to pay development charges. If you remove development charges from that, you increase the yield on cost by about another 10%. And so in total, you're getting a benefit of increasing your yield by about 30%, which makes this more and more incentivized for developers to actually do it, to build these things. And we need developers to have an incentive to do this, to be able to make profit. Otherwise, they're not going to. And anyone who wants to complain about that and developers being profit driven, I will accept your complaint if you're willing to do your job for free as well. Otherwise, it's invalid because we need to get paid to do our jobs. This is how incentives work. But the other really important thing to consider when comparing multiplexes beside high rises is they just simply cost less to build. And the reality is that the rents aren't that much different. Your per square foot rents might be a little bit lower for multiplexes than they are for condos because units are bigger, but the costs of creating a multiplex versus a condo are substantially different. So let's just take a look at them side by side. If you're building a multiplex, you're going to spend a little bit more on land costs because you're not getting as much output out of the land that you're buying. Let's say you're buying a 25 by 100 lot and you're going to put, 8,000 square feet there or 5,000 square feet there. Whereas with a high rise, you're buying an acre and you're putting 1,000,000 square feet there. So the output of the land is way higher for high rise. And so your per square foot cost on land is significantly lower. That's just a given, right? That's just math. But land costs are such a small portion of the total cost structure that it doesn't move the needle massively in either direction. Construction costs for a multiplex are going to be about, I would say, $300 a foot on the low end, $400 a foot in the middle, and $500 on the high end, which is significantly less than the construction costs of your high rise, where you're building out of concrete, you've got underground parking, there's way more in-depth mechanical feature, way bigger construction operation. And so for high rise, your construction costs are going to be like $500 to $700 a square foot, with the midpoint probably being around $600 a square foot. Your hard cost basically is where the difference comes from. Your soft costs can be a little bit lower on a per square foot basis for high rise because you have economies of scale. They can be a little bit lower on multiplexes because if you're doing it as of right and you don't have any minor variances, you can basically just get straight through. And then the other piece that gets stacked on top of that on a per square foot basis is that high rises are subject to development charges, whereas these multiplexes now are not going to be subject to development charges. And so on a per square foot basis, your cost is about 10 to 20% lower than it would be for a high rise when you're building a multiplex. But your rents are, let's say, $4 a square foot for a high rise and $3.90 a square foot for a multiplex. Really depends on the location, walkability, etc. The rental market is finally becoming rational again, and it does really value things like proper location, walkability, the whole 15-minute cities things that people are complaining about, etc. Beyond that, I think there are also a bunch of qualitative differences that I don't really like to get too into the woo stuff, but a lot of people talk about like gentle density. You go and look at some of the cities around the world that like are super photographable, that are beautiful, that people are really into. Toronto's done a really good job at density. We've done a really good job at high rise, but the model is dead, as it said there. And it doesn't really work well for purpose-built rental it's so hard to make the numbers work for high rise purpose-built rental. So we're going to see a lot more missing middle and multiplex. Like most of the housing starts that you're seeing in that chart that I showed about how purpose-built rental is replacing condo housing starts, most of that is coming from smaller formats and wood frame because you need to keep the cost low to get that debt service coverage ratio, to get your approval from CMHC. These have to be cash flowing. You're not selling the unit to somebody else and making it their problem, and then they're the ones absorbing the negative cash flow, which is how it worked in the condo format before. The units are better. The quality of life is better. They often have yards. They blend in a little bit more with the community. And historically, you saw a lot of those really beautiful cities, think Paris, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, etc. That's all missing middle. In North America, we were just given a blank slate and we chose the absolute worst way to urbanize, which was basically like parking lots and high rises. And now we're finally saying, oh shit, that didn't work. Let's maybe try it the old way. So now let's actually go inside a missing middle building and talk to Brandon from landlord.net a little bit about what makes these different than condos from a management and investment perspective.
Hi there, I'm Brandon Sage. I'm with Landlord Property and Rental Management. We are a residential management company in the city of Toronto, handling condominium units, single-family homes, and multiplexes on behalf of Toronto investors and landlords. And you're standing aside of one of our many multiplex projects that are taking place within the city that we look forward to showing you and hope you enjoy.
So you were just mentioning a big piece of this is people wanting to get more space, like from a neighborhood perspective. But I post a lot about multiplexes on social media and I get tons of comments like, oh, exactly what we need, more density. You know, this is no different than a condo. Let's double click on that first. Why is this different than a condo? I can very easily see it and explain it. But for people who are reluctant, they go down the conspiracy rabbit hole of like 15-minute cities and whatever. Why is this a better solution for our housing?
I don't want to act like this is a new solution. The fact is we're just following a model that's existed for 70, 80, 90 years. Anyone that lives in downtown Toronto has probably lived in a multiplex. It's a building, a house that might have been constructed 110 years ago that got converted at some point. Those apartment buildings naturally have very large units. There's lots of places, Palmerston Boulevard, Euclid, name any of your streets. They're in the streetcar suburbs that we've got. You'll find buildings that have spaces and layouts like this. It's just meeting customers where they're at, the tenants where they're at, and providing the space that they want and need to live. With the growth of condos as a housing option in the city, especially with the limitations placed on developers, limiting the number of floor plans you can have, the space you can build within, go towards smaller spaces. I think that's excusable close to downtown. But when you're building multiplexes in established neighborhoods where there are a lot of other towers and density around, you need to have space like this. So typical 4 or 5 or 6plex that we're allowed to build much more easily these days affords you the opportunity to create a living room that has distinct dining area, living area, straight walls that allow you to put up shelving and a space, a kitchen with lots of storage space. Hell, even a cabinet on the other side of the kitchen peninsula, and be able to design it in a way that, again, works with how people want to live. And when they walk in, to be able to just have a good feeling about the place and go, this is a place where I could see myself stay with my family for multiple years.
Yeah, you use the word family there. And another pushback that I get is, oh, we're only building houses for investors or single people. And I mean, there's no denying demographic trends in Canada. Our birth rate's been falling, middle class, young people aren't having families right now. This is a problem in the entire Western world. But then, I'll often have conversations with these people who use that as a criticism of multiplexes. And I'm like, this has a yard. It's accessible on a main road. It's got transit, et cetera. It's a large space. Like, it is different and it's more family friendly.
That's right.
And so when you mentioned talking about like tenant-led design, is that a big part of the design process, creating spaces that are comfortable for families?
I'm not aware of a condo tower in the city that doesn't have at least 50% one bedrooms.
Right.
I remember 10 years ago, I came across buildings that were 70% one bedrooms and bachelors. It just defies logic that you would build that many new units as your primary means of adding housing in the city and say, great, we're building housing units. Yeah, but what kind? So when it comes to towers, I'm sympathetic to developers that have to go that way because they are kind of forced into that direction for a number of reasons. When it comes to multiplexes, the interesting thing is that you do better if you go for the family demographic. Speaking from the property management perspective, we don't want high turnover. Single people turn over more. Families don't. Families stay put. They get their kids enrolled in school. They grow, they expand, and they are interested in a product like this. And a product like this does well, that serves those groups well. And it just meshes well with what is practical for us when we're constructing them. So you design it with all the aspects that appeal to the family and you'll attract them and they'll stay. And you see that in your ROI, you see that in your cash flow, you see that in low turnover, fewer gaps between tenancies, and with a better design product, you just get a better design renter.
Right.
And you're setting it up that you can benefit, so can the renter, so can the local community by having more families in, and so can just everybody from the stability that this form of housing can provide better than just a whole bunch of bachelors in one bedrooms.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess there's a lot to unpack there. I'm going to take it in two directions. The first one is around how incentives are changing, especially developers getting pushed into this very confined box. They kind of were forced to develop a lot of studios in one bedrooms. And then the other piece is the property management perspective, which I want to discuss after that. So high rise is like, I don't think it would be an overstatement to say the condo market is dead, right? And pre-con condos are dead. And there's a variety of reasons. One's the economics are, builders can't really afford to bring something to market for less than $1,200 a foot.
Right.
The market bids at like $900 a foot. And so nobody's going to be doing pre-con projects. The incentives that they had before also broke the economics of it, where they were pushing small units to get those pre-con investors excited about the low price tag. That resulted in a bunch of 400 or 500 square foot units. Now we're seeing the city really unlocking and being deliberate about, and the federal government's putting pressure on them about multiplexes.
Right.
How does that change the incentive for developers and the economics of it? Like, what does a project like this compute to? If I'm a developer, what kind of ROI am I getting? And risk profile by not building a huge concrete tower.
Let's start by talking about taxes. A good government taxes the things you don't want, and it doesn't tax the things you do want. Shout out to Anna Bailau for being the spearhead and getting up to 4 units without development charges. That was a game changer for us. Now, if you're going to build a high rise, getting your first 4 units isn't going to save you much when it comes to the total cost of building. Every new tower you go up is very heavily taxed. Everyone with units has a lot of money applied to it by the city. For us, though, for the first 4 units that we have here, and then at a laneway in the 5 units, there's no development charges, or they are, but they're a fraction of what they were before. Shout out to Olivia Chow, our mayor. If we can get that up to 6plexes, which is being discussed at the moment, that is setting up an incentive structure where we get a break as developers to construct these and not have these incredibly high taxes that are ultimately costs that we will pass on to the customer. And if we can't pass those on, then we just don't build and prices go up. So it's by taking those taxes back and dialing back to what they were 20 years ago when development charges were 5,000% less than they are now. I realize the math doesn't work perfectly on that. It used to be very low from 2006, early 2000s until now. I know it's gone up like thousands of percent, and to keep us having the lowest property taxes in Ontario. But the reality is that by having that tax structure change, it's made it easier for us to do this. And then, of course, the demand that exists for 3-bedroom units in a city that's not building enough and 2 bedrooms has set us up to be able to get the kind of rental values that we're looking for. The numbers start to work when you're looking at it on a pro forma, when you're deciding whether or not to go for a project, especially when matched up against financing options that are available. CMHC coming to the table is a very important thing in terms of getting long amortizations and better interest rates, as well as a variety of other incentives that they offer. So it's a combination of things that set us up to do these in a more effective, sustainable, and affordable way that appeals to the kind of clients that we're doing these for almost exclusively, which are long-term holders. You're standing in someone's pension plan. This is not a flip. We don't do that kind of work for that kind of investor. This is going to be held by the same client for 5, 10, 20, 30 years. There's a good chance it's going to get passed on to the client's offspring. And it's just a place that the numbers work for when it's that basis that we're building them.
Amazing. Let's go to the property management side of things now. So talk to me a little bit about, I imagine you have a really good insight on both the occupant, tenant, and the investor's perspectives.
We've got a set single family houses, 1/3, condos, the other third, multiplexes, the other third.
Okay. So without forcing you to insult the condo
Yep.
product, because I think it has a place. And what differences do you observe in like the discussions that are happening? I know you mentioned turnover. What are the pain points? What are the pros and cons
Yeah.
of each?
I think you got to look at housing like cars. I'm not going to insult someone who's got a 2-door vehicle or it's just a single person driving it. Fine. That's your 1-bedroom condo. But if you've got a family, you're probably going to want a sedan, a power wagon, or a minivan. I'm not going to insult someone who's driving that if they've got 3 kids in the back and their spouse.
Right.
So the denigration that does exist within the housing sector to me just parallels that. Someone wants to drive a particular car and it works for them and it's appropriate, great. I'm going to probably look down on a family that's trying to have a bunch of kids in the back of a coupe. That's not going to work. From a management experience, what you see with multiplexes is just longer tenancies. So the turnover's a lot less.
Right.
Average condo, year, maybe 2 years, some exceptions, 3 years is your length of stay.
Very transitory.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because most of the condos are 1 bedrooms
Yeah.
and 2 bedrooms. However, with multiplexes, most of the units, depending on the design of the building, are going to be 3 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms even. In those cases, you inherently have a longer stay. You're also finding these products in different areas than towers are in. There's only so many places that a 50-story tower can exist in, whereas with a multiplex, they tend to be in established neighborhoods or in locations that are inherently more family oriented. And if you're attracting a family demographic, even if it's a family of 1 of 2 living in a 2-bedroom apartment, in the area because of schooling reasons or because other families are in the area, they're just naturally a demographic that sticks around longer. It leads to more stability. And for the clients that own these properties and are gravitating towards them, they're also taking a longer view in terms of their ownership, the same tenant, multiple years. And it allows them to go the longest period of time without thinking about the property. The lesser turnover means the residents know the house better. They're more on top of reporting issues to us. For us as well, there's also the greater understanding that we have, the longer that we manage. So it really breaks the cycle of just constant turnover, flipping, cycling through. It sets us up to just have virtuous cycles spin up on more and more levels of the entire enterprise compared to condos, which I tend to find have more vicious cycles that can be more problematic. I make it a more challenging management experience, especially for the lower fee that we charge. Sometimes it's just not worth it when we've got the issues that we have at some of the condo units that we manage.
Right. I guess it just naturally sorts, even if you examine the demographics or economics of it. People move downtown when they're young, upwardly mobile. They want close proximity to the workplace and potential mates. And they find one of those and they start a family and go to a more established neighborhood.
So the question I asked is, what do we know better than many of the best cities in the world where families do live downtown? Understanding that you go downtown, hook up, and then get out, move to the burbs is just an antiquated notion.
Yeah.
As a city, we would do well to move ourselves away from, because the city downtown should be for families. It shouldn't just be emptied out at the end of the day. Even Metrolinx has figured this out, which is why we have 2-way transit on the rail corridors, and they're expanding that and adding more times. People should live all across the region. You go to Berlin, it's not like that. Right. You go to London, it's not like that. We shouldn't be following the Buffalo model or the Los Angeles model. We shouldn't be following the model of failed cities. We should be following the model of cities that really truly rank at the list of the most livable places to be and the top cities in the world. That's where families live, downtown in those places.
Jane Jacobs, who wrote The Life and Death of American Cities, was obsessed with the annex back in the day when she lived here. You can still do the Jane Jacobs tour. She loved it because it had all of these old houses that have been converted into plexes, many of which have now been converted back to old mansions. To me, that's really interesting, right? You see all of those, the European housing model, like Canada, the US, a couple of other new world Western countries have these, we have like massive square footage per capita. Fortunately or unfortunately, policy wise, we're heading more in that European direction. What has to happen is that's going to shrink, right? Square footage per capita. So the suburban lifestyle or this new urban lifestyle is actually going to be probably mean smaller floor plates on an individual basis, but maybe a better city connectedness, et cetera. You're going to be speaking at our upcoming Multiplex event. You were one of our favorited speakers last year. I saw all of the lineup of people trying to speak with you after your presentation on the panel. What are you going to be talking about at that event to bring as much value to the audience on what they need to know from a management and design perspective?
So I think just building on what was discussed last year, I was alluding to projects like this that we had going on without having shared any details. So that's why it's great this year to be able to have an opportunity to bring you through what it was that I was speaking about when I was on stage calling out one of the terms I used was we have one of the designs that are popping up in the city. And again, with all due respect to condo developers, that we're not respecting basic human dignity. When it comes to designs like this, we pride ourselves on creating spaces that we know renters are going to like, because we have that perspective of having to work with that renter every single day after they move in. If this place isn't working out for them as a home, if any of our places aren't, we experience the blowback from that. And so we eventually, when you see these patterns over time, you begin to see that places that aren't designed with that understanding create anxiety, they create conflict, and then that just makes it tougher for us to manage. It's tougher for the client. It's also tougher on the tenant who's just trying to get by day to day. Certainly coming up for the session, and any opportunity I have to expand on that and be able to advocate for design and allowing more easily projects like this to exist is going to be important. And it's going to take a lot of people firing in the same direction for that to occur. And the city is the one that is in the best shape to help with that.